slowed slightly to a trickle. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a bit of a start. So first up, a very big welcome to Bath Pain Forum. My name is Jeremy. I work here at the Bath Centre for Pain Services. I'm the research lead and I'm going to be MC for today. You probably all know that this is the Bath Pain Forum. It's a quarterly open online lecture series, and we'll say a little bit more about how you can stay in touch if you're not fully plugged in a little bit later. So it's being run out of here, the Bath Centre for Pain Services. Again, probably most of you know, but we're one of the UK's national specialist clinical centres for the treatment of severely disabled adults and young people with chronic pain. So the interesting bit is introducing Abbie, which I will do in just a moment. Just a couple of things first about the meeting. So first of all, you've probably all noticed that we're recording this meeting, and the idea is that we'll put it up as a private link on YouTube, which I will share with all of you guys so that you can pass it on to anybody who missed it or might have missed the meeting. Abbie's talk is going to raise loads of cool questions, and we've got time for questions at the end. So can I encourage you guys to use the chat function to either discuss the talk or pose some questions? If you definitely want to pose a question, then please direct some of the chat to the host, which is going to be me, and I'll keep track and try and summarize and make some sense of the questions at the end. And there's quite a few of us here now, so I'm just going to ask everybody if we can make sure we all stay muted for the duration of Abbie's talk. So I think that's probably all of the housekeeping taken care of. So can I introduce Dr. Jordan now, please? It was such a lovely thing to have Abbie here, who is a long-standing friend and collaborator in our unit. I'm going to do the traditional thing and tell you a little bit about her. So Abbie is a reader at the Department of Psychology at the University of Bath, and she's also part of the Centre for Pain Research at Bath University. Quite a few of you will already know Centre for Pain Research is sort of a nationally, internationally important research grouping at Bath University. And Abbie leads the Children in Pain section. Am I right there, Abbie? The Children in Pain section of the Bath Centre for Pain Research.
Yes,
awesome.
Children and Family, yep.
She's also a bit of a legend in our small field of paediatric pain, and she has lots of international collaborators, most conspicuously at Calgary in Canada and Stanford in the US. And in terms of her career in paediatric pain, Abbie's made huge contributions in the area of measurement and creation of scales for measuring function and distress in children with pain. She's really led in exploring parents and parenting in the topic of paediatric pain. And she's really innovated in methods. And I think some of that's going to come out in this talk. If we're looking at qualitative methods, we're looking at getting close to the child and the parent's experience. How do you do that? Using interviews and using other techniques, such as diaries. And I think Abbie is going to probably describe some research relating to that. And maybe this stuff is really the only way that you can get close to topics like identity and maturity and a sense of development in young people with pain. So I think without any further ado, I will keep an eye on all of your questions and chat. It's an absolute pleasure to have Abbie here, and we will let her get started. Over to you, Abbie.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's a very lovely introduction. Just bear with me while I share my screen, which I'm hoping, can you, oh, hang on, just put it on the proper view and then it will switch it around as it likes to do. So hopefully now, Jeremy, is that the right way around? Yeah, good. Takes a while. So yes, thank you for a lovely introduction, and thank you to the Bath Pain Forum for having me come and talk to you today about taking a broader perspective. So I really want to think about essentially the social and developmental context of paediatric pain. I hope I live up to what Jeremy has just said. If I don't, Bath does. So if you haven't come to Bath yet, and it's been quite tricky recently, I'm aware of this, here's some highlights you should definitely see. So I'm actually talking to you from the psychology building at the University of Bath today, which is this rather lovely one. lovely sunset, minus the sunset currently, but here's some other lovely things that Bath does have to offer. I always like to give a bit of context. And of course, Jeremy has also mentioned Bath Centre for Pain Research, which is headed up by Professor Chris Eccleston and Deputy Director Prof. Ed Keogh as well, who I think is in the audience, Ed, because I saw your little picture pop up. So hello, Ed. And here's everybody else that's in the Bath Centre for Pain Research as well. Sorry, my lights have just gone out. This is always the way if you don't move, so don't be too sedentary is the message there. So to get us started, I thought I would give us a really brief overview of the field of paediatric pain. Jeremy mentioned that it's small, and he's right. It's small but important, I would say. We have somewhat lagged behind the field of adult chronic pain, actually, in terms of research, although we are certainly making great strides. And I think this is a great place to start, actually, by talking about a paper by a very lovely colleague and friend, Lena Cass, who's at Stirling. So she conducted a study looking at all the papers that have been published in the field of paediatric pain from 1975 to 2010. That is quite a beast of a project. I was involved in that, but it's very much her thing. And the graph kind of really shows just how little was known starting out in 1975. We only had 41 papers in the actual area whatsoever. And pretty much since 1990, 96% of those papers that have been published since 1990. That really shows you how quickly it's beginning to grow, but actually how small it was originally. It's also important to remember that even into the 1970s and right up into the early 1980s, we were not anaesthetizing babies, that were having surgery in some cases, because we still were thinking that either their nervous systems were not developed enough to feel pain or that babies don't remember pain. So just bear that in mind, as shocking as that might seem, and it still is to me, particularly as a parent, that that's where we're coming from. So just bear that in mind as a starting point, I suppose. So that's kind of where we start, but you can see this rather lovely increment on the graph to see that it's accelerating at a good speed. So what about chronic pain? Because that's been very much my interest and what I really would like to talk to you about today. So chronic pain in children and adolescents. Most of the work that I've done has been and weird things about unmute. So hopefully you can all hear me now. Has been about that adolescent time point. I find that particularly interesting, but we'll talk about that in just a second. But we know that actually chronic pain is pretty common. So there was a study, a meta-analysis study conducted by King and colleagues based in Canada. Canada has a large number, even though it's very large, they still have a very large number of pain researchers. They're very dominant in lots of the research that comes out, showing that up to 38% of children and adolescents at some point report chronic pain. Now, for a number of those, chronic pain will be very disabling. So that's not the case for everyone, it's just a pretty common experience. But for a number of those, and they're the ones that we typically focus on in our research here, are those that find chronic pain really difficult, affects many aspects of their lives that we'll talk about in just a second. In terms of age, we see a real onset in adolescence, which is another reason I find it particularly interesting time point to study. There's something about that adolescent period as puberty kicks in that we see an increase in young people presenting with chronic pain, and particularly girls, it has to be said. So that's kind of what we know. These are pretty established findings across a number of studies. And of course, some of these young people who present with chronic pain will become adults who live with chronic pain, which may be some of the people listening to this talk who have the most experience of all. So this is just an example of a study that shows this really. So it's a study by Larson which looked at 13-year-olds presenting with headaches every week and actually found that 19% of those young people 14 years later were still reporting headaches. So we know that some of these young people will become adults, and it's another reason why it's a really important time point to actually study and see if we can kind of stop this from happening and hopefully preventing the development of chronic pain into adulthood. And actually that's the kind of move from acute to chronic is also another shout out really for Emma Fisher, who's doing some important work in this area. Okay, doesn't like me using my buttons. Let's use that's better. It likes the mouse better. So this is not a published model. This is just me trying to give some context today, actually. So I can't talk about everything I want to talk about, which is sad for me, but probably good news for you because we could be here for a couple of hours otherwise. So as with all of the research that we do in our lab within the centre and with international collaborators, because it's always a we and it's never an I, the adolescent is at the centre. And of course, we know that chronic pain impacts a number of different areas of the lives of young people. So we know that it can make going to school really tricky, staying in school for fear of being perhaps knocked in the corridors, or, you know, concentration, because pain can be so difficult, to, you know, other physical tasks, to sleep, all of those types of things. I'm not going to talk to you about that today. Obviously, we know that these studies exist and there's a lot of research looking at that. But what I'm really interested in is the kind of social development, which is why adolescence is so interesting, I think. So the kind of normative tasks that we do as teenagers. So, you know, becoming more independent from your parents, hopefully, usually across the span of adolescence, young people move more towards doing things with friends and kind of less so with parents, to developing those peer relationships, to developing romantic relationships, thinking about identity. That takes a big focus in adolescence, although identity is always changing. It's never quite a stable thing. So that's the kind of area that really interests me, I want to talk to you about today. But I can't do that without thinking about other people, because other people are critical. And Jeremy's already mentioned parents, and that has been a big focus of my work really to date. I'm not really talking about parents today, so I'm sorry parents, because you play an important role hugely, but I can't talk about you today typically. But they play a really important role in supporting young people who have pain and looking at their own functioning, because actually we know that being a parent of a young person who has chronic pain can be really tricky for parents too, understandably. But also friends, I'm going to touch on that a little bit today, healthcare providers, clinicians, and there's been some work that Alex Neville, who I think is also listening, actually has done, looking at diagnostics uncertainty from the perspective of paediatricians specifically, and how they manage that when treating children and young people with pain. So we need to acknowledge their role as well. And other people, I've already mentioned romantic relationships. That's something we're starting to look at in upcoming research, actually. So other people play a really important role. But there's something even wider than that. Of course, how pain is viewed in society, how it's portrayed. And the last study I want to talk about today, which I'll come to right at the end, oddly enough, talks about that wider societal influence and how pain is understood and depicted. And that's where the Canada connection comes in, as well as in other studies, of course. So that's kind of how I want to position what I'm talking about today. I can't do all of it, but that's where it sits. So I almost really want to take you on a journey. It's not been quite as sunny as this today, but you know, we can all live and hope. So I want to tell you really where we started. Where did our interest develop, and where is it going? That's kind of how I'll let carry on. Okay, so Jeremy's already mentioned the measurement. I don't want to focus massively on this today, but I do feel this was such an important starting point in our focus on social development. So Chris Eccleston, who I've already mentioned, headed up the development of the Bath Adolescent Pain Questionnaire, which is basically a questionnaire that I know the Bath Centre for Pain Services use, as do many other centres internationally, to look at how chronic pain impacts on the lives of young people, with different subscales looking at different types of functioning. If people are interested in using it, it is freely available. We don't get commission. I always feel like I'm on a sales call if I say something like this. You just need to go to the link here, which we'd be happy to share, and just register your interest, just so that we know who's using the measure. So it's been validated for use in young people 11 to 18 years who have ongoing pain. One of the subscales that I'm mentioning looks at social development. So we, to our knowledge, were the first people that actually put in a subscale that looks at these developmental tasks and where adolescents perceive themselves in relation to other people. So this is what we did. We added in, and this was very much in conjunction with people from the Bath Centre for Pain Services. So I don't know if Hannah's listening, and Jackie, Jeremy, lots of other people too. So very much a collaborative effort, looking at how young people perceive their development on certain tasks. So for example, you can see the items here. There are 11 items in this subscale. Their progress in school. So do they perceive themselves to be very ahead their peers in their progress in school, to little ahead, pretty much the same, a little behind, or very behind? So this was just one of the subscales that we used. And this is kind of jump-started the research that we've done. So we included it, we validated the questionnaire, but then we were so interested that we actually conducted a study looking at this specifically. So this is kind of where we started in our journey. I realize this is not so recent. So we asked 110 adolescents recruited from BCPS actually to complete these items as part of the BAPQ, and we looked at the number of items. There were a number of analyses, but what I'm going to talk to you about, the number of items that they felt behind or ahead on. So at least half of them felt behind on 4 of these 11 items. Actually, 91% felt behind on 1 of them. So we're already getting a sense of things being a bit behind. So when we looked at overall, without looking at the actual number, when we looked at whether adolescents broadly felt behind or ahead on particular items, the circled purple ones were where they felt behind. So generally, rather than feeling the same or ahead, adolescents felt behind their peers. So their peers who don't have chronic pain in their progress in school, their overall confidence around other people, how often they do things without parents around. So that kind of big focus on independence and autonomy. Oddly, my overall independence, which just ties in with that, but specifically independence from parents, tapping those 2 items, and their ability to go on dates with boyfriends and girlfriends. The more I read this, it sounds a bit dated now. We are talking some time ago that we completed this, and not in COVID times. I know no one can go anywhere until recently. And the item circled in red was the one item that broadly adolescents who live with chronic pain reported feeling ahead. So actually it wasn't all bad news. There was some good news, and actually in terms of sort of emotional maturity, adolescents reported feeling ahead in terms of their ability to deal with problems compared to their healthy peers who don't live with chronic pain. So this was a really useful start, but we thought, okay, this is really great. So, you know, in some aspects of these domains, young people, adolescents feel behind, and some of them they feel ahead, but what does that actually look like? What does that mean to these young people? And you can kind of see where the qualitative interest comes in, and this is really where our journey started, looking at social development. So this was our first qualitative paper, and I do have some quotations, but I promise this is not going to be a presentation that is death by quotations. There are a few, they will appear in places, but not all the way through. So we really just started out asking a very small group of adolescents about what does development mean to them, who have chronic pain, obviously, otherwise that wouldn't really work. How does living with chronic pain impact on their ability to do these kind of normative tasks? I promise you we didn't phrase it in that way because that would not be very paediatric friendly, but that's what we were interested in. And we analysed the data qualitatively. I'm always happy to talk more about methods, but I don't think that's the focus for today. And we generated 2 themes as a result of that, which is just a way of synthesising the findings based on our interpretation as researchers and clinicians. You can see Jeremy and Hannah from the clinical perspective, and we've got some researchers. So there was a real hybrid of researcher and clinical input into this paper. So here are some of the quotations. So the 2 themes, the first one, an externally imposed lens on identity. I'll just let you read that for a second. So this was about developing a sense of identity. But actually, this isn't always something the adolescents can do. So, and where does pain sit within that sense of identity? And as you can see here, Sophie, and I promise these are not the real names of participants, we would never do that. It's not good practice, it's a pseudonym. It's talking about actually, it's really tricky for her to develop this sense of identity because other people have done that for her. And she's no longer an individual with her own interests and her own personality characteristics. Actually, she is defined by pain, not because she sees it like that, but because broader society, other people, and in this context, sorry, clinicians, she was talking about clinicians broadly, are perceiving her as a pain condition rather than an individual. So actually it does, living with pain does have an impact on identity, but a kind of socially constructed way of doing that. It's not just about a personal impact on her, but it's how other people see her. And that was really tricky for her. Of course, this wasn't the case for all. For other young people, pain was part of them, but actually was something that they felt they could still identify their own characteristics in this. So I'll let you read this just for a second. just need to move the people at the bottom because I can't see the name. Alice, thank you. Couldn't quite remember who it was. So Alice, in inverted commas, is talking about how she still very much identifies as a dancer. That's still very much a part of her, unlike in the other quotation where so this individual didn't feel that she was defined as someone who likes a particular hobby or because pain was the defining factor for other people. But actually for Alice, it was a bit more complicated than that. And she was able to see herself and hold on to something that was really, really important to her, which for her was dancing. It doesn't matter what other people say. It's about holding on to that as a key sense of who she is. I don't have any identity theory at this point to back this up. This was a real starting point for us to start thinking about the key areas in social development. We didn't focus particularly on identity. We just asked broadly about these sort of developmental tasks, and identity was a key thing that was salient for these young people. So it's about that social and personal impact. But the other theme was talking about the paradoxes of developmental progress. So where these young people sit in terms of their expected progress. So if I let you read this just for a second, you read Emily's quotation. So she's talking about having to resit a whole year of school, and this feels a bizarre time to be talking to you about this, as school has never been in the news more in terms of isolation and people staying away, and it's a whole different time right now, and I know this, but this was pre-pandemic. She's talking about having to restart a whole school year, which is disruption, of course. That's placing her on a different trajectory to her peers academically. So she's no longer traveling a kind of along the cohort she was with to start with. If you think about your own trajectory, or perhaps if you have children, you know, they typically start in reception and they follow the same cohort through. They might change classes, but they follow that cohort through till they move into secondary and it all changes. And there's that kind of expected line. Well, actually for Emily, that had changed. And that was really difficult, but it's not just about the academic element of that. It's having to fit in with a whole new peer group. So all those shared experience that she'd had with the year group that moved on where she resat, suddenly she had to establish new links with those new friends that would be her peers in the relevant year that she joined. So it's just that social change as well. So it's kind of knocking these children, in the case of Emily, into different trajectories. It's not the one that they expected. However, of course it's more complicated because nothing's that simple. And that's what qualitative is really good at doing, I think, is showing the nuances and differences between participants and within understandings of these particular ideas. So for Ben here, actually, there is some positivity, certainly, and he's talking about how he's having to deal with things that other people wouldn't do. So in terms of emotional maturity, he feels, yes, again, his developmental trajectory has changed, but it's ahead. In terms of mastery of kind of emotional development, problem-solving skills. But it's not just, you know, this idea of being ahead or behind, but actually he talks about using some skills that people probably don't even use in a lifetime. He's talking about adults here. So it's actually this idea of developing new skills and personal growth, which kind of provides some element of positivity. So it's complicated. Developmental trajectories change, but it's not just a case of being ahead or behind. It's way more complex than that. But we know that these are issues that young people face. Okay. So moving on to this, because I'm just trying to keep an eye on time. This is where one of my lovely PhD students, who is now almost technically a doctor, because she passed her Viva on Friday with minor corrections, Abbie, so well done, comes into play. And I'm going to talk about some of the studies that she's conducted. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about our scoping review, but we really wanted to look at this point. What does the literature say? What do we know about these developmental challenges and how they're negotiated by young people who experience pain? So she looked essentially at three particular areas. So autonomy, we know that's an issue from the previous studies. She looked at identity, she looked at peer relationships, and you might see here, because I think you can see my cursor, that there actually weren't that many eligible articles anyway. So there were only 42 articles we could even include in our review, which is interesting in itself, of course. Most of them being in the peer relationships category. So there's way more out there about peer relationships than there is in anything else, and certainly less about identity. One of the paper I just mentioned to you was one of those. Actually, that was one of the eligible papers, not because we're trying to promote our own research, because it met the eligibility criteria. So what do we know? And I hope Abbie is now going to forgive me because I've chopped up her lovely infographic that's in the paper to make it fit my slides, so I'm sorry about that. Key findings, and I'm not going to read all of them. Autonomy. Actually, when age-appropriate autonomy is present, we know that there are good outcomes in terms of things like quality of life and family functioning. That's going to change a lot over an adolescent lifespan. What you're going to ask an 11-year-old to do, and I do have an 11-year-old, is not what you're going to ask, expect of an 18-year-old. So it is the fact that it needs to be age-appropriate for that particular age. But when that is evident, it's associated with good outcomes. In terms of peers, so over here, we know that young people who have chronic pain, from the evidence that we reviewed, report a sense of loneliness and that peer relationships are affected. We also know that positive peer relationships can negate some of the negative outcomes that are associated with living with chronic pain. So positive peer relationships are really important, but can be tricky. And in terms of identity, really not a lot is known, actually. And that's not surprising, given I said there weren't many papers. And we also know that young people who have chronic pain report a desire to be normal, and I will put that in inverted commas because I'm not really sure what normal is, but that a sense to be like other people, perhaps. I don't think normal is that easy to define, and it's different for everybody, but they feel different, I guess. That's what the evidence suggests anyway. So where do we go from there? So it's becoming more recent. You can still see my journey or feel my journey or even be on it with me maybe, looking to where we are and hopefully where we're going. So we completed a study, again, headed up by Abbie Jones. I do have PhD students who don't have the name Abbie, I promise you. It's not a full criteria, I'm the only one. You can have other names too. Looking at, essentially, really looking at identity, because a part of who you are is also about how you perceive yourself and where you're going. So we were really interested in how adolescents perceive their future. And we did something that's pretty unusual. We used what's called a story completion task. So that's when you ask people to write a story. It's usually in the third person, so it's usually about somebody else. So, and it's usually, I don't know, might be about a relationship or something like that. I don't know, somebody's found their husband's been unfaithful, they come home to find this, what happens next? But actually we did something quite different. We made it in the first person. So we asked young people to imagine the story stem that's here. We asked them to imagine their effectively a high school reunion, because we figured that most people should be able to relate to that, and ask them think about 10 years from now, they're going to the high school reunion, what are you going to be telling your friends, what you've been up to? And you will see that we deliberately didn't mention pain, by the way, in this. We asked them to do this online as part of a bigger study, and we just asked them to write a response to that. We didn't say any more than that. So we asked 50 young people. So they were 14 to 25. They were a bit older in this study, because actually asking a younger, we did pilot it and it didn't quite work so well because it's quite a complex thing to do. And these young people actually had CRPS specifically. It wasn't, I want to say just chronic pain, but what I mean is it was a specific diagnosis. So to self-report a diagnosis of complex regional pain syndrome. So what did we find? Well, the analyses were complicated, and I'm going to present some of them for ease and time. So this is where you are going to get some more quotations, although I promise after this there are no more. So we generated 2 themes as a result of an inductive thematic analysis. Sorry, that should say thematic analysis, my bad. So the first one focused on the centrality of loss. Loss was a big focus throughout the paper, throughout young people's experiences. And the second one was more positively focused on adjustment to loss. So in terms of centrality of loss, the idea was that CRPS had robbed these young people of their imagined future. Because of course it is an imagined future. We're asking people to project into the future. We're not asking them to report retrospectively, or we're not following them up longitudinally, I wish. We're asking them to imagine what their future in 10 years' time would be like. So you can see here for Amy, she says, I would talk about what I had, not what I have. I would talk about my achievements, but not my hopes and dreams. So suggesting that CRPS had robbed her effectively of her hopes and dreams. Really sadly, I hope no one wants to keep in touch because I don't have much of a life anymore. Obviously, we're hoping these futures don't pan out, but it's interesting to think about the role of loss and what CRPS is perceived to have taken for these young people. Now, the role of loss and its impacts differed among participants. So for some people it affected them, they perceived that it would affect them more than others, and the losses might have been more specific. So it might mean in some cases that they felt they wouldn't get married when they would have done before, those types of things. So sometimes they were more broadly affected, as in the case here for Amy, in talking about hopes and dreams. So she's not able to achieve what she wanted to achieve because CRPS has kind of got in the way and said that's not possible anymore. But thankfully that wasn't the case for all. And actually, a number, and I hesitate to use that with qualitative research, I'm trying to think of another thing that doesn't reference the word some, perhaps. Some adolescents talked about adjusting to the sense of loss. So acknowledging that CRPS may involve changes in their lives, but actually either the CRPS wouldn't be present at all. There were certainly young people who either didn't reference it whatsoever, like Joe here, so didn't reference it in their imagined future, who said, I would become a paramedic or an ICU pediatric nurse after attending university. So either CRPS is gone or it's just being managed appropriately by treatment and is no longer affecting them in a way that's impacting on their life. So achieving plans that they had before, so really not interrupting at this point, or people had adjusted their plans. So perhaps that meant not quite doing the college course they wanted to do, but adjusting to something that might be more manageable, associated with the constraints of perhaps continuing living with CRPS. Or in this case of Rachel, really suggesting this idea of flourishing and personal growth, which is just quite frankly phenomenal. So talking about, I hope to have turned this ugly thing into something beautiful. So even at this point of living with CRPS, having a major impact on their lives as they did at completing the study, being able to imagine a future that was very different and thinking about how they might work towards that. And we did have some really, I can't share them with you now, I know because of time, really detailed studies that talked about what they would do and how they would manage that, from managing to live independently with the aid of an assistance dog, to changing career plans, to all sorts of things that were achievable and living happy, fulfilled lives. So I think it really does also speak to the real hope that actually was featured, even though the bigger themes talk about loss. It's how these young people adjust to these losses in a really positive manner. So that was kind of methodological innovation, to use Jeremy's terms, but also an interesting way to think about the future. And I've got a couple more studies to talk about, and I think I've got time to do that, so that's good. So following on from Abbie's story completion study, this is the beauty of having amazing students, so I'm ever thankful to them. I want to tell you a little bit more about some other analyses that we did using these stories. So I think I mentioned the story completion study was actually part of a bigger study. So we also asked young people of the same age who didn't experience chronic pain to complete these stories. So if you remember, I can flick back really quickly. There we go. If you look at the story stem, it doesn't reference CRPS, so it could be completed equally by a young person who doesn't experience CRPS or any other chronic pain, which is exactly what we asked. There we go. So we asked similar number for various reasons of dropout. We have 49 adolescents who have CRPS, and we also have 49 adolescents who don't experience any chronic pain whatsoever and haven't historically done. So we were looking at the types of language these young people, whether there were differences between the groups, because in the previous study, we only looked at young people with CRPS. We don't know what types of stories that young people who don't have chronic pain would have developed. We have no idea what they would think about their future. And there is some literature about that, but not enough to kind of give us an indication. So we were really interested in making that kind of level of social comparison. So again, that role of other people. So we used some language software called the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which is really called the LUC, which is a lot easier to say, thankfully, for me. So this was headed up by Emmy Nimbley, a previous master's student who is gone on to do a PhD elsewhere because she's fab, with Emma Fisher, who I think is also in the audience, and so that's good. Okay, so what did we do? We looked at the language. So we actually took a quantitative approach, which for those that know me might be a bit of a surprise, to look at the language that these young people used in these very same stories we'd analysed in the previous study. So the Luke basically looks at, it has a dictionary of 6,500, that's right, words, and it looks at the frequency of words in certain categories. And we chose to look at particular categories. So we looked at affect words. So these might be, so these are the ones at the top here. So affect, so words that indicative of positive emotion, words that were indicative of negative emotion, anxiety, anger, sadness. And we were looking at whether there were differences between the group of young people with CRPS and the group of young people who don't experience chronic pain. I hope people forgive me for using the word CRPS group. I'd never write that in a paper or when I was talking to people, it was just shorthand for the table. We also looked at social processes. So we looked at words that reference family, friends, female, male. These are not my terms. These are the Luke dictionary terms. We also looked at cognitive words. So we looked at words that referenced insight. So those are the kind of self-appraisal words. And we looked at words that to do with causation, to discrepancy, so difference or lack of differences, and other types of cognitive approaches. To make my life easier, and yours, I circled the ones where it was significant, because that makes everyone's life easier in a long table to look at. So effectively, we look at whether there was a difference across the total number of affect words, so at the top here. So without looking at the subcategories first, there weren't. But what we did find is that young people in the CRPS group used fewer positive emotion words. That's not that surprising. They used more negative emotion words, not surprising. No difference for anxiety, which we did find surprising. Maybe all adolescents use high levels of anxiety-related words. The young people with CRPS used a greater number of anger words and sadness words. So certainly the role of affect was different between the two groups. Really surprisingly, and I am very surprised because social factors and those types of things are really interesting to me. And we know that there are social factors that play an important role in young people's experiences of chronic pain. No significant findings whatsoever across the total, my mouse is not playing ball, total number of social process words, but also for the individual subcategories. Rather surprising, but there you go. Now, cognitive processes, this was interesting. So actually, overall, the CRPS group used a larger number of cognitive words when they were writing about their future. And the two kind of significant findings in terms of these effectively subdomains were about insight. So these were the self-appraisal words, if you remember rightly. I know the categories have funny names. This is just the way the Luke categorizes them effectively. I can't give them better names because those are the ones we have. So they effectively made a greater number of self-appraisals. So how they sit in relation to other people than young people who don't have chronic pain, and also discrepancy. So this one was about differences or lack of differences. So again, really suggesting there's something about these cognitive mechanisms, this ability to compare with others. So again, that broader social context is there, even though it didn't come up in the social process words. So they didn't talk about words like friend or buddy or mum or dad differently. They did talk about them, but not differently between the two groups. But the kind of idea of self-appraisal was something that we found. There is something about the social context in relation to that. That's something that I'm not aware has been done in the pain literature either. So I guess another bit of methodological innovation. Now, the last study I do want to talk to you about, which I think I've just got time to talk about, really puts the social in the social. So this is a study headed up by the fantastic Melanie Noel at the University of Calgary in Canada, and also her fab student Kendra Mui, I think that's how I say her surname, so apologies Kendra if that's not right, looking at how pain is depicted more broadly in the media. So I'm part of this, but very clearly headed up by them. Although interesting, the conversation Mel and I had about this was here at the University of Bath when we said we'd really like to know how pain is shown socially and how children, how children's pain is talked about. And we started thinking about using books, which we plan to do. So I should stop giving away all my ideas. We've been working on developing that. But Mel very rightly thought about looking at media. So why not? That's what children are watching, never more so than now after pandemic times. Or maybe that was just mine. So what did we do? So we looked at coding popular films and TV series that were aimed at children aged 4 to 6. So quite different to what I've presented until now. So not looking at chronic pain specifically, not looking at adolescents specifically, but really focusing on a much younger age group, the kind of golden age, so to speak, in terms of Learning, so much learning goes on at that point from what's going on around them, but also development of fears, particularly in relation to sort of painful procedures. So a really interesting developmental time to look at. So we looked at coding incidents of pain in 10 films. Now this is like a test. I can't remember all of them, but I always like to give some examples. So most popular films in terms of highly grossing films that are aimed at this age group, and things like Frozen. I mean, if you have children, you will know Frozen. Despicable Me 2, Zootopia, Toy Story 3 and 4, Finding Dory. But we also coded all incidents of pain in 6 TV series aimed at this particular developmental age group. So the entire first series of these 6 chosen series. So things like Octonauts, Shimmer and Shine. Some of these were supposed to be more girl orientated, some of them were supposed to be more boy orientated, and some were supposed to be gender neutral. Peppa Pig, of course, I will tell you if you're interested about some of the media interest about Peppa Pig after this, because it went a bit crazy. Daniel Tiger's Neighbourhood, for those that are Canadian that are watching, because we don't have that here to my knowledge. So we essentially, I say we, Kendra, coded 52 hours of TV and film or movies for the North Americans, looking at prevalence of pain. So how many instances of pain did we see? Types of pain that were depicted. Are we talking someone falling out of a plane? This did happen. These are generally cartoons and not real things, well, yeah, obviously. To someone falling over in the playground, to those types of pain, or someone having an injection, less obviously the case, to interestingly how other people responded to that pain. So what did other characters do when a character was experiencing pain? Because we all know that children model their behaviors in part from what they see, not just from the media. I'm not remotely saying that. Parents, all sorts of peers, all sorts of other influences, but social influences are important. But also gender differences, on whether there were differences in terms of whether girl or boy characters responded differently, and how other people responded to them, and also how girl and boy characters were depicted to respond. I'm not going to talk about the actual coding that we did. If you're interested, I'll happily send you the paper. But we looked particularly at coding everyday instances of pain in these particular categories, and also in terms of how people respond, the kind of empathic or not responses shown to characters. So that's what we did. So what did we find? Well, in terms of the types of pain portrayed, by far the most common was injury. I mean, that's not that surprising, but these were quite often quite extreme injuries, like the falling out of a plane, rather than the falling over in the playground. And violent acts. So 1 in 5 of, these are percentages, sorry, I should have said that. 1 in 5 kind of incidents were to do with violent acts. What's much less common, unsurprisingly, chronic pain, the kind of medical procedural pain. So that's someone going to the doctors, having an injection, vaccination, or I don't know, having a bandage on. Those types of everyday instances actually that children do see, all the kind of falling over playground type thing. So definitely a large depiction of injury and violent acts. So not typically what children would actually see in real life. I realize this is TV. Okay. So in terms of how much pain did we see? Around 8.66 incidents per hour. So that's pretty common. These are not TV shows or movies that are focused on painful things. You know, Frozen, it's not really what you jump to. You don't think about chronic pain or acute pain. You think about princesses and ice. Or maybe that's just me. I have girls. I'm still recovering after my Frozen couple of years, I think. But what else happened? So what about other people? So 10% of the characters that were shown to be experiencing pain showed a response. So when there were instances of pain, 10% of those characters showed some response in some way and or asked for help from other people. So showed that they had been impacted. You know, we all display pain behaviors when we're hurt, or a number of us do, and we know that they depend on whether, you know, who's present, who's not present, who those people are, all those types of things. That's not my research, that's Rhiannon Edwards' work springs to mind off the top of my head. But also, of those incidents that were depicted, 75% of them were seen by other people, other characters. I know it's difficult. I want to say people, but you know, Peppa Pig. I'm not sure Peppa Pig's a person. We'll go with character. And that makes sense. But what's really shocking is of those 41% of the incidents seen by other people, those other people did nothing. So actually, there's a large number of people, or characters, sorry, seeing pain, but actually doing nothing. And that, if you think about a learning experience for children, is quite problematic. So what else did we find? Now, I did mention that gender was a focus, so did want to focus on this, and I'm just coming to the end, so this is probably good timing, I think. So in terms of pain instances, not just how often does it occur, but what happens in terms of boy and girl characters, actually way more commonly depicted in boy characters, as you can see here. And not only did we see more pain in boy characters, we saw more severe and distressing pain. So the more violent acts happen to boy characters than girl characters. So some element of gender there. But what about how observers responded to boy and girl characters? Absolutely. Differences there too. So observers were more worried about girl characters than boy characters and more likely to help them, which is interesting given that girl characters experience fewer instances of pain anyway. And observers, as in other characters effectively, were more likely to show inappropriate responses. So things like laughing, mocking them, things like that to boy characters than girl characters. That's not very nice, but definitely an impact of gender here. And finally, thinking about those observers, so not just who's being observed, but actually the gender of those observers, boy observers, so those boy characters were more likely to laugh and offer verbal advice to, the paper uses the word sufferers, it's not my choice, I don't particularly like it, but to those characters experiencing pain, which is kind of interesting because that's negative and positive in both effectively. The verbal advice, you know, to go and do something about it is helpful. The laughing at them, not helpful. No one likes to be laughed at generally, and if you're hurting, that's the very last thing you want to do. I realise this is TV, I'm not taking this too literally, but it's an important social influence. And in terms of girl observers, those girl characters seeing other people, other characters, one day I'll get it, experiencing pain were way more empathic than they were, than boy observers were. So there was something about empathy there. So actually low levels of empathy generally from those characters, but actually observed much more in those girl characters. So gender again there. So this is kind of coming back to where I started. This is the really broad social, because I do think the research needs to look at all of these things, and I can't cover all of this, and we can't do all of this work. Our work sits within a wider body of what everyone's doing in the amazing field of paediatric pain, and it really is a real international tight-knit community that I'm lucky to be part of. So thinking about the research that we've done sits right at the center, the adolescent, as it absolutely should. All these other people around it. So you know, parents and families, that's a talk for another time. And the peer relationships, we touched on a bit today, talking about how peer relationships are important. Also that element of social comparison. Healthcare providers is some work that we're trying to develop a bit further. And the other work looking at romantic relationships that Bernie Carter's just developing, that I'm working with her on as well, is something that needs to happen, particularly as we talk about adolescents as they get older and become more independent and start moving away from home and developing romantic relationships. We know very little about that. So there's lots that still needs to be done. I think the last study really provided an important social context, and that the way we think about pain depicted also relates to how society considers pain, and changing those societal perceptions and how pain is modelled is way more tricky. If anyone has the answers to that, let me know, because we certainly don't. So on that note, and I think the timing of that works quite well from what I can see, I would like to say thank you to a lot of people. People that have, organisations that have funded our work, like the Pain Relief Foundation, who are fab, and the Rare Disease Foundation, but also lots of individuals that are on my slide. Abbie Jones has to have a mention because she's a newly minted doctor, but also because a lot of what I presented was hers, but also other people on this slide as well. If you do want to contact me, my contact details are here, but other than that, I will hand back to Jeremy for any questions. So thank you for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Abbie. Usually we have a round of applause at this moment, and I think it's happening virtually. I can see thumbs up and things like that. Okay, brilliant. Really, really interesting. So what's lovely was we have had a couple of questions come through, Abbie. So can I just lead with one? So somebody was asking, we've asked these adolescents about their futures, about how they see their development, about what's going to happen in 10 years' time. How much of this do you reckon is specific to chronic pain? Or how much of this do you reckon is slightly more generic in adolescents with any kind of chronic condition? Would it be terribly different in asthma or cancer or anything like that? And do you have any sense from the literature as to whether it is?
I think that's always a really good question, Jeremy. I think there are some parallels. So, for example, we know in some of the sort of long-term condition literature that young people with other conditions that sometimes do involve pain as well, because of course pain is involved in so many long-term conditions, inflammatory bowel disease. It can be involved in cancer as well, which perhaps a slightly different context. Do feel different, can feel lonely. Those types of kind of normative challenges that young people with chronic pain also report. But so there is some similarity, definitely. I would imagine, although I am talking off the top of my head, I suppose, rather than evidence-based about futures. I know less about that because there's certainly a reduced literature about perceptions of future in adolescents, in particular long-term conditions. I do think there's something specific about chronic pain, quite often because it can be difficult for other people to fully understand chronic pain. I think that's often, I don't mean the clinicians or the researchers or the people on this call at all. I'm preaching to the converted, and I know that. But we know, having had many conversations, particularly with parents actually, that it's other people disbelieving their young person, disbelieving them, or young people themselves being disbelieved. That can make things really tricky. And I think that's what's often quite unique about chronic pain. If there's not an obvious reason for why young people are experiencing it, that can make things extra difficult and add an added layer. So I do think there is something unique about chronic pain. But there are parallels too. That's such a cop-out answer, Jeremy. I'm sorry. It's a bit of one and a bit of the other.
Thank you. Okay, so just looking at the questions that are coming through, and some of them are actually working around your diagram of parents and partners and things like that. So let's just start with partners. Have you got any views on the future of research on romantic relationships and how we support young people to make healthy relationships and avoid dependent ones?
Oh, that's such a good question. So timely. Can I say come back in about 2 years' time for that one? Because Bernie Carter, who I've just mentioned, who is just fantastic at Edge Hill, has just got some money that we're working with her on to develop a project looking exactly at this. We did recently do a scoping review, because we like scoping reviews in our lab, looking at romantic relationships, but not in young people who have long-term conditions, many of which involved pain. But it wasn't pain specific because there is so little known. I think it's a real key area. We know that young people can struggle to develop romantic relationships because they haven't done some of the groundwork that other young people who are more able to get out and about and meet people can do if they're more severely affected, but there's not really a good evidence base for that. But we are really keen to develop that. So we're looking at sort of an 18 to 25 year age group off the top of my head, looking at how we can look at that. And we're talking to partners as well as young people who have chronic pain to kind of get both perspectives and think about how we might support them better. Sorry, that's not very good because I just don't think there's enough evidence out there at the moment, but I do think it's a really important area.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And so not surprised that you're on it already. So we've had a question come through, which is probably relates to your broader research on parents. Somebody was asking about young people in chronic pain who have parents in chronic pain, and particularly the situation where the young person has possibly seen a parent lose function over time and become more affected by pain, and how that affects them. Obviously, that's coming from the broader literature, but it's an interesting question that you might be able to speak to, Abbie. Can you speak anything about the literature in that area?
We are starting to realize it's not work that I have done, I have to be honest, but people, Melanie Knoll is just one of them, Amanda Stone as well off the top of my head, have done work looking at parental chronic pain. It's becoming a real interest, actually. I think what's difficult is to make sure that there's no element of blame. I think that's always the slight worry in research, not that they're doing, it's just how we talk about it and how we present it. It's just a huge challenge for everyone, isn't it? Because actually we do know that a large number of parents who even come through our studies, we're starting to ask, out of interest, how many of these parents have chronic pain, and it's certainly higher levels than you would expect in a typical population. So I think that is something that we need to do more about. I don't know that we know enough, certainly clinically, to really comment on that anymore. I mean, you would know better than I do, I suppose, but from the research literature, I think it's just looking at the kind of prevalence levels at the moment, but I don't think we know enough to really say any more on that. I feel like I keep giving you cop-out answers, but I think these are developing areas. I mean, it's good that people are asking about this, because this also helps us realize that we're asking the right questions, that these are the topical ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experiences being one of them, parental chronic pain, romantic relationships. These are areas that people haven't really looked at before. We've looked at parents and what it's like to be a parent who has a child with chronic pain, and we've looked at how we can support parents better to do that, and, you know, manage their own functioning as well as those of the young people. But we haven't really looked at the kind of dynamic between parents who have chronic pain and their young people, how that might work.
Thank you. Right now, with Pain Forum, we have a solemn promise to finish by 5, but I'm just going to squeeze one last little one in here. So looking at the impact of identity, it might well make a difference as to whether you got chronic pain at a much younger age before you had any chance to do the identity development, or got it at a slightly older age where you'd already begun to define yourself slightly. Any observations about that or data about that?
We don't have data about that, but again, I think that's really important. It's something we've certainly thought about. I mean, this is where we would just laughed. Can you just imagine the beauty of a longitudinal study from, you know, a very young age right the way through? Because actually, we know that there are normative adolescent periods that are really critical for developing that sense of identity. So whether that is just, if chronic pain hits at that time point, whether that's much more problematic. My gut instinct is that it would be. My suspicion, and it is totally hypothetical, would be that children that have developed chronic pain much younger will be more successful, whatever that means for them, or be happier perhaps in development of their own identity, because I think that's what it means, successful. Who's successful in developing their identity or not? What does that even mean? That's another study. I think it will be an easier process for them than perhaps adolescents who develop chronic pain at a time where going out with your friends, it becomes more critical, and young people can't do that because they're more reliant on parents when they're not really expecting to be. And that's also quite tricky for parents, and our research has shown that much earlier on, actually. There's developmental issues for parents too, as their adolescents develop chronic pain and they think they're more likely to become independent as parents, and actually they're having to do more things for their young person because they can't. So it's tricky for everyone. So I do think that's what I think we will find, but no research yet has been able to follow that up. And also because it's really tricky to measure identity, which is what the scoping review showed. There was very little out there. It was pretty much qualitative, which of course is great, but measuring identity is tricky. So that's what I think we will find. And I do think there is something there, but that takes the beauty of a very large funded study. So if any willing donors are on the call, just let me know.
Okay, well that's brilliant. And apologies to the couple of questions we've not got to, but we're gonna finish on time, and so we'll wrap this up. Say a massive thank you to Abbie for just a delightful presentation, ranging lightly over a range of areas of expertise and methodologies which we come to expect from her. So thank you, Abbie. Hugely appreciated and lovely to have you as a collaborator. So everybody else, just to let you know how we're going to wind things up. In the next couple of days, you'll get an Eventbrite email through from us, where we'll put the link to the recording of this on YouTube. And if you want to get in touch with the team to ask about slides or to ask about being kept in touch, all of the contact details will be there. Best way to stay abreast of the BCPS, the Pain Forum things, is on Twitter. So keep in touch with us on Twitter on @BCPSBath, and all of the Pain Forum events will be tweeted through there. So you'll hear from us soon. Thanks so much to everybody who came. And it's amazing we've even had people zooming in from Canada, which is indicative of Abbie's reach and popularity, I think. But we will call this a wrap for today. So thank you very much to everybody, and have a good evening. Okay, bye-bye.